Szanowni Państwo, w imieniu Polskiego Towarzystwa Naukowego Prawa Prasowego oraz prezesa Towarzystwa pana profesora Jacka Sobczaka mam zaszczyt powitać wszystkich Państwa na konferencji naukowej zatytułowanej Profesjonalizacja dziennikarstwa, organizowanej z grantu Ministra Nauki i Szkolnictwa Wyższego. Jest to jedna z dwóch konferencji w ramach tego cyklu, druga już za 2 tygodnie, poświęcona nowym mediom. Serdecznie zapraszam już w tym momencie. Ośmieliłem się Państwa powitać w imieniu pana Polskiego Towarzystwa Naukowego Prawa Prasowego i pana profesora Jacka Sobczaka, upoważniony przez pana profesora, który bardzo chciał być tutaj, ale niestety choroba mu na to nie pozwoliła. Bardzo chciał spotkać się z przyjaciółmi, wziąć udział w tej dyskusji. Mam nadzieję, że już na kolejnej konferencji będzie to możliwe. Jestem pewien, że pan profesor, że Jacek jest z nami dzisiaj myślami. Jacku, bardzo dziękuję. Bez Ciebie zorganizowanie tej konferencji nie byłoby możliwe. Trzymamy kciuki, żeby wszystko poszło dobrze. Szanowni Państwo, mam zaszczyt poinformować, że naszą konferencją, obie nasze konferencje realizowane z grantu Ministra Nauki i Szkolnictwa Wyższego, patronatem objęli Rzecznik Praw Obywatelskich, pani profesor Ilena Lipowicz, prokurator generalny Rzeczpospolitej Polskiej, pan Andrzej Seremet, Krajowa Rada Radiofonii i Telewizji, jego magnificencja rektor Uniwersytetu Adama Mickiewicza, pan profesor Bronisław Marciniak, dziekan Wydziału Nauk Politycznych Dziennikarstwa, pan profesor Tadeusz Walas, Okręgowa Rada Adwokacka. Witam w tym miejscu przedstawiciela dziekana Okręgowej Rady Adwokackiej, panią mecenas Katarzynę Golusińską, oraz Okręgowa Izba Radców Prawnych. Te dwie ostatnie instytucje również wsparły nas finansowo, za co już w tym momencie bardzo dziękuję. Proszę Państwa, chciałbym również poinformować i wyrazić podziękowania za objęcie patronatem medialnym przez Polskie Radio S.A., Dziennik Rzeczpospolita, grupę Polskie Radio Merkury w Poznaniu, grupę Polska Press, oddział prasy poznańskiej. Chciałbym również przywitać serdecznie gości, którzy zechcieli przyjąć nasze zaproszenie. Pozwolę sobie przedstawić bliżej uczestników, zaproszonych gości w trakcie kolejnych paneli. Witam również członków i sympatyków Polskiego Towarzystwa Naukowego Prawa Prasowego. Mam nadzieję, proszę Państwa, że towarzystwo będzie kwitło. Chciałem poinformować Państwa, że strona internetowa od niedawna działa. Myślę, że będzie to znakomita okazja, forum do wymiany poglądów w zakresie problematyki, którą interesuje się Polskie Towarzystwo Naukowe Prawa Prasowego. A teraz bardzo proszę o otwarcie konferencji dziekana Wydziału Nauk Politycznych i Dziennikarstwa, pana profesora Tadeusza Walasa. Panie dziekanie, zapraszam.
Szanowni Państwo, szanowni zainteresowani problematyką profesjonalizacji dziennikarstwa, bardzo się cieszę, że Polskie Towarzystwo Prawa Prasowego zechciało swoją konferencję zorganizować i przeprowadzić na naszym wydziale. Wydział nasz jest bowiem żywotnie zainteresowany profesjonalizacją dziennikarstwa. Na naszym wydziale zajmujemy się między innymi kształceniem kadr dla mediów i dla szeroko rozumianej sfery komunikacji społecznej. I nie ukrywam, staramy się każdego roku programy kształcenia, jakie realizujemy, doskonalić po to, aby nasi przyszli absolwenci byli coraz większymi profesjonalistami, aby opuszczając mury naszego uniwersytetu, byli przygotowani na wyzwania, jakie czekają ich na coraz bardziej trudnym rynku pracy. Nasz wydział prowadzi w tej chwili 5 kierunków studiów. Prowadzi kierunek politologia, stosunki międzynarodowe, bezpieczeństwo narodowe, zarządzanie państwem, no i właśnie kierunek, który nazywa się dziennikarstwo i komunikacja społeczna. No, zadaniem tego kierunku jest właśnie kształcenie kadr, jak już powiedziałem, które zasilą szeregi dziennikarzy. No, staramy się obserwować to, co dzieje się na rynku pracy, co dzieje się na rynku medialnym. No i w oparciu o te obserwacje staramy się w procesie kształcenia zwracać uwagę na to, aby ci, którzy u nas studiują, kończyli studia legitymując się możliwie bogatą wiedzą ogólnohumanistyczną, ale także wiedzą specjalistyczną, wiedzą, jaką wykorzystają w przyszłej pracy. No, zwracamy też coraz większą uwagę na to, żeby nasi studenci w okresie studiów poszerzyli swoje umiejętności. No i dlatego też zadbaliśmy o stworzenie bazy materialnej do prowadzenia studiów dziennikarskich, a więc urządziliśmy i myślę, że dobrze wyposażyliśmy studio radiowe, studio telewizyjne, mamy pracownie komputerowe, a w tej pracowni na komputerach zainstalowane najnowsze programy, które są wykorzystane w redakcjach i to w redakcjach o renomie światowej. Poza tym, po to, żeby nasi przyszli absolwenci byli możliwie dobrymi profesjonalistami, staramy się też o to, żeby w okresie studiów poszerzali swoje umiejętności, doskonalili swoje umiejętności, pracując w wydziałowych studenckich mediach. Proszę wyobrazić sobie, że na naszym wydziale funkcjonują 2 zespoły telewizyjne, funkcjonują 2 gazety, w całości redagowane, tworzone, redagowane przez studentów. Rozpoczęliśmy w zeszłym roku także prace, które doprowadziły do uruchomienia wydziałowego radia. Także studenci już w murach tego wydziału mogą wiedzę teoretyczną poszerzać, weryfikować na zajęciach praktycznych, ale też poprzez pracę w wydziałowych redakcjach. Dużą wagę przywiązujemy także do praktyk zawodowych. Każdy, kto podejmuje studia 1. stopnia, studia licencjackie, musi w okresie studiów co najmniej 6 tygodni spędzić też w redakcji albo w redakcjach już nie studenckich, ale tych, które żyją, że tak powiem, z uprawiania dziennikarstwa. Na studiach magisterskich natomiast one trwają tylko 2 lata, w związku z tym czasu na praktykę jest nieco mniej. Tamta praktyka jest tylko 4-tygodniowa. Szanowni Państwo, bardzo się cieszę, że ta konferencja się odbywa, bo nie ukrywam, mam pewnego rodzaju oczekiwania, jeżeli chodzi o jej wyniki, a więc liczę na to, że w dniu dzisiejszym, w toku debat, bardzo się cieszę, że te debaty będą odbywać się także z udziałem gości zagranicznych, uda nam się ocenić dotychczasowy model dziennikarstwa, model wykonywania zawodu dziennikarza. Uda nam się na pewno zwrócić uwagę na czynniki, które determinują funkcjonowanie dziennikarza w dzisiejszej redakcji i w ogóle na rynku medialnym. No i poza tym liczę na to, że owocem tej konferencji będą ustalenia, w oparciu o które będziemy też mogli doskonalić programy kształcenia na kierunku dziennikarstwo i komunikacja społeczna. Szanowni Państwo, wszystkich serdecznie witam. Bardzo proszę czuć się w murach tego wydziału jak u siebie. No i proszę pamiętać, że jesteście tutaj zawsze mile widziani. Na naszym wydziale odbywa się sporo konferencji poświęconych tematyce medialnej, ale także konferencji na inne tematy, dlatego że na naszym wydziale zatrudniamy kilka zespołów badawczych. Jedni zajmują się komunikacją społeczną, inni badaniem polityki, stosunków międzynarodowych. W każdym razie myślę, że każdy z Państwa poprzez udział w przeróżnych konferencjach może poznać nasze środowisko, ale także może, myślę, sam zweryfikować swoje naukowe ustalenia. Poza tym, wchodząc do sali, już to zauważyliście, nasz wydział wydaje czasopisma naukowe, kilka czasopism naukowych, a więc jest możliwość związania się z naszym wydziałem także poprzez publikowanie wydawanych przez nas periodyk. Szanowni Państwo, życzę miłego pobytu, a przede wszystkim tego, żeby ten pobyt był satysfakcjonujący, a więc żeby spełnił on nasze wspólne oczekiwania. Proszę Państwa, już na wstępie pragnę gorąco podziękować panu profesorowi Jędrzejowi Skrzypczakowi, panu profesorowi Jackowi Sobczakowi, którzy byli pomysłodawcami tej konferencji. Bardzo dziękuję całemu zespołowi pracowników i współpracowników, do których zaliczamy doktorantów, studentów naszego wydziału, za to, że możemy w dniu dzisiejszym w tej sali się spotkać, żeby rozmawiać na tak ważny i istotny temat.
Panie Dziekanie, bardzo dziękuję. Jak już wspomniałem, pan profesor Jacek Sobczak niestety nie może być dzisiaj obecny z powodów zdrowotnych, ale skierował do uczestników konferencji specjalne posłanie. O odczytanie poproszę pana doktora Bartosza Chordyckiego.
Wielce szanowny panie dziekanie, drogie koleżanki, drodzy koledzy i przyjaciele. Szanowni uczestnicy konferencji. Tylko w tej formie mogę się zwrócić do wszystkich Państwa, chociaż tak bardzo chciałbym uczestniczyć osobiście w obradach konferencji. Niestety, na udział w niej nie pozwala mi mój obecny stan zdrowia. Uniemożliwił on mi także w ciągu ostatniego miesiąca brania udziału w pracach organizacyjnych. Cały ich ciężar spadł na barki profesora doktora habilitowanego Jędrzeja Skrzypczaka, obecnego kierownika Zakładu Systemów Prasowych i Prawa Prasowego na Wydziale Nauk Politycznych i Dziennikarstwa UAM i jednocześnie sekretarza Polskiego Towarzystwa Naukowego Prawa Prasowego. Za trud włożony w organizację konferencji jeszcze raz publicznie jako prezes Towarzystwa dziękuję profesorowi Jędrzejowi Skrzypczakowi. Gdyby nie jego starania, konferencja niestety nie doszłaby do skutku. Podjęty problem profesjonalizacji dziennikarstwa, statusu prawnego dziennikarza, gotowości mediów do wielokulturowości uważam za niezwykle ważny. Dopiero w ostatnim czasie problem statusu zawodowego dziennikarza został przedstawiony w Polsce w oddzielnych monografiach autorstwa docenta doktora Tadeusza Kononiuka z Uniwersytetu Warszawskiego, dr Joanny Taszkowskiej z Uniwersytetu Kazimierza Wielkiego w Bydgoszczy i dr Lucyny Szot z Uniwersytetu Wrocławskiego. Status prawny zawodu dziennikarza w Polsce nie został zdefiniowany. Wątpliwości budzi nawet kwalifikowanie działalności dziennikarskiej jako działalności zawodowej. Pojawienie się nowych mediów spowodowało poważne zmiany w pracy dziennikarzy i w rezultacie praktyczną redefinicję dziennikarstwa pojmowanego jako zawód. Coraz większe wątpliwości budzi to, kogo obecnie można zaliczyć do grona dziennikarzy, zarówno w sensie prawnym, jak i organizacyjnym. Kwestia ta wiąże się z takimi zjawiskami w internecie jak dziennikarstwo obywatelskie, blogi, podcasting, videocasting, intercasting. Rozstrzygnięcie wspomnianego dylematu ma doniosłe konsekwencje praktyczne, zważywszy, że dziennikarze jako grupa zawodowa wyposażeni są w szczególne prawa i obowiązki, w tym między innymi prawo dostępu do informacji, obowiązek zachowania tajemnicy dziennikarskiej, obowiązek zachowania szczególnej staranności i rzetelności przy zbieraniu i wykorzystywaniu materiałów prasowych, obowiązek ochrony dóbr osobistych informatorów, a także szczególne obowiązki tych dziennikarzy, którzy podejmują się roli sprawozdawców sądowych. Na kwestię tę nakłada się problem profesjonalizacji dziennikarstwa, gdyż zachodzące zmiany we współczesnych mediach redefiniują zarówno pozycje, jak i oczekiwania kierowane pod adresem dziennikarzy oraz wyraźna, zauważona w literaturze zmiana paradygmatu wolności prasy. Nie wątpię, że konferencja pozwoli na nieskrępowaną wymianę poglądów, wywoła ożywioną dyskusję uczestników. Jestem przekonany, że władze dziekańskie Wydziału Nauk Politycznych i Dziennikarstwa, jak zwykle na organizowanych w tutejszym ośrodku konferencjach, zapewnią warunki tego, aby spotkanie było nie tylko owocne naukowo, ale i miłe towarzysko. Szczególnie dziękuję Ministrowi Nauki i Szkolnictwa Wyższego za wsparcie finansowe konferencji, a rektorowi Uniwersytetu imienia Adama Mickiewicza, Rzecznikowi Praw Obywatelskich, Prokuratorowi Generalnemu RP, Krajowej Radzie Radiofonii i Telewizji, Okręgowej Radzie Adwokackiej w Poznaniu, Okręgowej Izbie Radców Prawnych w Poznaniu za objęcie patronatem. Natomiast Polskiemu Radiu Rzeczpospolitej, Radiu Merkury, Grupie Polska Press za patronat medialny. Konferencja w dużej mierze dotyka warstwy prawniczej, dlatego myślę, że dewizą jej powinna być łacińska paremia. Lex justa, libertati, equalitati et fraternitati presidio est. Podpisano profesor zwyczajny, doktor habilitowany Jacek Sobczak, prezes Polskiego Towarzystwa Naukowego Prawa Prasowego.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie doktorze. Chciałem Państwa również poinformować, że na ręce organizatorów wpłynęły listy i życzenia owocnych obrad. Pisma takie skierowali przewodniczący Krajowej Rady Radiofonii i Telewizji, pan Jan Dworak, zastępca Rzecznika Praw Obywatelskich, pan dr Ryszard Czerniawski, dyrektor Biura Prokuratora Generalnego, pan Ryszard Tłuczkiewicz, jego magnificencja rektor Uniwersytetu Adama Mickiewicza, pan profesor Bronisław Marciniak, prezes zarządu, redaktor naczelny Polskiego Radia S.A. pan Andrzej Siezieniewski, dziekan Rady Okręgowej Izby Radców Prawnych w Poznaniu, pan mecenas Zbigniew Tur, wicedziekan Rady Okręgowej Izby Radców Prawnych w Poznaniu, pani dr Krystyna Babiak oraz Okręgowa Rada Adwokacka w Poznaniu. Proszę Państwa, po tych powitaniach myślę, że czas na obrady. Proponuję przejść bezpośrednio do pierwszego panelu. O moderowanie dyskusji poproszę panią dr Agnieszkę Stępińską. Cieszę się, proszę Państwa, że ta konferencja rzeczywiście, zresztą nie tylko w tym panelu, mam nadzieję, będzie miała wymiar międzynarodowy. Dlatego tym bardziej miło mi powitać Karin Wahl-Jorgenson z Cardiff School of Journalism. Pana Tzvi Reicha z Uniwersytetu Ben Guriona w Izraelu. Elde Brogi z Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom University Institute, European University Institute we Florencji. Z Eldą nie mieliśmy okazji spotkać się rok temu, kiedy byłem na stypendium w European University Institute we Florencji, dlatego że Elda była wtedy na zwolnieniu lekarskim, na urlopie macierzyńskim, przepraszam najmocniej. I cieszę się, że w takim razie możemy spotkać się tutaj w Poznaniu. Chciałbym również powitać pracowników naszego Wydziału Zakładu Systemów Prasowych i Prawa Prasowego, panią profesor Dorotę Piątek, pana doktora Szymona Osowskiego. Cieszę się również, proszę Państwa, że zaproszenie do udziału w tej debacie przyjęli reprezentanci stowarzyszeń dziennikarskich, Wśród nich chciałbym powitać pana senatora Ryszarda Sławińskiego, Stowarzyszenia Dziennikarzy Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej, pana mecenasa Alberta Stawiszyńskiego, Stowarzyszenia Dziennikarzy Polskich, ksiądz dr Roman Piwowarczyk z Katolickiego Stowarzyszenia Dziennikarzy, który miał być w ostatniej chwili, niestety nie mógł do nas dotrzeć. Cieszę się również, że w tym panelu wystąpi pan Piotr Frydyszek, przewodniczący Rady Nadzorczej Radia Merkury, ale także przecież wieloletni prezes Radia Merkury i znakomity dziennikarz. Także serdecznie witam Państwa i zapraszam do stołu obrad. Oddaję mikrofon pani doktor.
Good morning, everyone. The idea of this session is to divide it actually into two parts. The first part will be the presentations, so we will start with a couple of presentations, and after this part we will invite all of you to share your comments, share your opinions, to introduce some new ideas, or also if you would be interested, you may of course ask the questions which will be directly related to the presentations. So that's the general idea of this first session. So the first person who will be presenting her presentation is Karin Wahl-Jorgensen. She's the Director of Research, Development and Environment at the Cardiff School of Journalism. She will present the paper on challenges to journalistic professionalism, on technological change, boundary work and epistemologies of journalism. Karin, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for coming here this morning. And I would like to extend special thanks to Agnieszka for her hospitality and also for inviting me to come here in the first place. And also thank you very much to Adam Mickiewicz University and to the very generous funders who have allowed this event to happen. What I want to do today is that I want to talk specifically about how new media technologies in generating new participatory opportunities might challenge journalistic paradigms, practices, self-understandings and ways of knowing. So that is sort of the main topic of my talk today. And the broader aim of my talk is to actually try to think through some key issues around journalistic professionalism with respect to a series of research projects that I've been involved in over the years. And what I'm particularly interested in is thinking about how notions of journalistic objectivity, the idea that journalists ought to be objective, might be under challenge at a time of shifting relationships between journalists and their audiences. So just to tell you a bit more about some of the work that I do, at the moment I am particularly interested in taking seriously the role of emotion in mediated politics, with a particular emphasis on journalism, for better or worse. So I'm going to use this talk as an opportunity to link together work from specific research projects that I've been involved in over the years, which examine various forms of participatory media practices, or, to be more specific, ways in which ordinary people tend to get involved in media, in public participation in the media, and the ways in which these participatory forms have been incorporated into or potentially challenged the epistemology and self-understanding of professional journalism. So I'll be talking about that specifically by looking at work over time, first of all on letters to the editor in newspapers, and then subsequently user-generated or amateur content in the media. And I'm doing this through the lens of taking an interest in the role of emotion in journalistic storytelling, and hopefully that'll become clear exactly what I mean by that. But I'm interested in how technological change, as it's reshaping conventional boundaries between journalists and their audiences, might also challenge conventional binary oppositions of the relationship between objectivity and emotionality in journalism. And what I'm specifically going to argue is that the expression and elicitation of emotion, in terms of making journalistic storytelling quite emotional, have actually always been very central to conventional journalistic storytelling, at least in sort of Western and Anglo-American journalism practices, but that they've been managed in specific and rule-governed ways through what I call the strategic ritual of emotionality. At the same time, however, ordinary people's personal and emotional stories have always been valued in participatory formats like letters to the editor. What is changing now, I think, is that with the increasing prevalence of things like user-generated content, and also online platforms where ordinary people can contribute their own stories, personal and emotional stories told in new and non-objective forms have become very central to news content and challenging the ways of knowing, the ways of constructing knowledge of conventional journalism. So, just to try to put this into perspective, the past decade or so has seen widespread debates around changes in journalism brought about as a result of new technologies and changing priorities of news organizations. And scholars have taken a particular interest in the kind of participatory potential of new technologies, ranging from blogs. Oh, sorry. Can you?
Closer to your mouth, I would appreciate it.
Okay, can you hear it now?
My friend will tell you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so scholars tend to take a particular interest in the participatory potential of these new technologies, and also understanding how these new technologies might actually transform journalism practices. So the rise of new forms of participatory technologies is often described by commentators and practitioners as part of a larger set of trends which might be revolutionizing journalism by disrupting traditional relationships between journalists and their audiences. And that's, as I will argue, these kinds of disruptions tend to force journalists into actually defending the boundaries of their profession. So journalists are getting quite nervous about what they see as an incursion from new technologies like user-generated content, and consequently feel that they have to defend their own professional practice. So, my research has always been focused on the relationship between journalistic practices and forms of audience participation. And really, it's always revealed a kind of uneasy relationship between, on the one hand, ideals of journalistic objectivity and impartiality, and the place of emotion in the context of looking at audience participation. And so that's what I'm interested in exploring here today, by looking at how this is played out in the transition that's sort of very crudely sketched out here on my slide, from very traditional participatory technologies like letters to the editor, where you have a clear separation between what is journalistic content and news-related content, and then a special letters to the editor section in the newspaper, and then on the other hand, user-generated content and social media, where increasingly those boundaries between the professional content and the amateur content is very much breaking down, so that now audience participation, at least in some forums, comes to be an integral part of media offerings. And so how has journalism responded to that, and how is that changing journalistic ways of knowing? So one key change that we can see, in other words, is that the place of what we might call audience labor in providing content for media organizations has shifted from being very sort of physically, temporally, and spatially marked off or sectioned or even ghettoized on in a place like the reader's page or letters to the editor, to actually being an integral part of particularly broadcasted online content, or even entirely indistinguishable from professional contributions, as in the case of sort of an anti-hierarchical structure like Twitter, for example, where the emphasis on immediacy rather than hierarchies of news values, or rather than on signaling the professional authority of journalism. So what that's meant is that both in a very physical but also in a conceptual sense, the boundary between professional and audience labor has shifted, and that also challenges forms of authorized practice in journalism. Now, my specific interests in this area relate to a concern with what you could see as one of the key structuring tensions in journalistic work, or at least I'd like to think that it's a key structuring tension in journalistic work. And that is a tension between providing objective and impartial coverage, and then, on the other hand, the need to engage audiences at an emotional level. And today I'd like to raise some questions about how technological change might affect the place of emotion in journalism. So I'm writing a book about this at the moment. It's called Emotions, Media and Politics, and I hope that it will soon come out from Press. So this is a little pre-publication advertisement for those of you who might be interested in this area. And in the book that I'm writing, as well as in a couple of recent articles, I'm interested in looking at this in the case of, in the broader context of what we might call an affective turn, or a turn to questions of emotion across humanities and social sciences. Now, in addition to technological change in journalism, what people have argued is that we're also seeing a shift towards a more emotionalized form of media content, which involves the performed contribution of ordinary people. And what I mean by that to say is that at least in the West you see a growth in, specifically on television, things like reality television and television talk shows, which tend to rely increasingly on emotionalized performances by ordinary people. So this kind of emotional and performed contribution becomes part of the vocabulary for talking about media content. So that there's a much larger discussion to be had about that, but you can see that as a growing trend in terms of television content. That spills over also into public discourse more broadly, and into, as I'm going to demonstrate later, into how audience members actually assess journalistic content as well. So I'll try to demonstrate that later. But what I would argue is that nonetheless, historically, emotion has tended to be denigrated, or has tended to be dismissed in journalism studies as the binary opposite of rationality, and therefore opposed to objectivity and impartiality, which are very key aspects of professional self-understanding. And this kind of denigration or dismissal of emotion represents a blind spot in the field, which renders invisible, makes it impossible for us to see the actual place of emotion in the production, text, and reception of journalistic texts. And so just to try and be a bit more specific about what I mean by that, one of the key areas, one of the several areas where I've investigated this, is in looking at how award-winning journalism, which could be seen as representative of cultural capital or quality in journalistic work, how does award-winning journalism use emotional language? And how does it try to elicit emotional responses in the audience, even if such award-winning journalism is also seen as exemplary of professional ideals such as objectivity? So by using content and discourse analysis of Pulitzer Prize-winning articles across a range of different genres over 2 decades, what I've suggested is that this kind of exemplary, excellent form of journalism, in this journalism there is what I call a strategic ritual of emotionality. Journalists who win the Pulitzer Prize are not only excellent in terms of showing their skills as in terms of conventional understandings of journalistic excellence, they are also excellent in terms of using tools of emotional storytelling. They use these tools by, first of all, employing specific discursive regimes that rely on the explicit expression and elicitation of emotion according to consistently applied and routinized rules. And what I would also suggest is that this strategic ritual of emotionality, this use of emotional storytelling, peacefully coexists with, and sometimes also is in direct tension with, the strategic ritual of objectivity. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that for the most part, you get a very extensive expression of emotion in Pulitzer Prize-winning stories. You get a very extensive use of anecdotal leads that tell stories about the experiences of particular individuals. And in fact, very frequently in the judges' official citations of why particular stories have been given the Pulitzer Prize, you get a recognition of how these stories were moving, or how they were touching, or how they generated empathy. So you get explicit recognition of the place of emotion in these stories, but nonetheless you get it in a very specific and rule-governed way, because one of the things that occurs is that even though words that talk about emotion and emotional stories are very widespread in these Pulitzer Prize-winning stories and series, it's never journalists talking about their own emotions. They outsource emotional labor to their sources, so they are always talking about the emotions of their sources, and sources will be talking about their own emotions, but journalists never talk about their feelings. So what this establishes is that although emotion may be denigrated or dismissed in conventional discourses around journalism, the use of tools to express and elicit emotion is at the same time integral to the professional journalistic toolset, but built into storytelling in such a way that it doesn't threaten claims to journalistic professionalism with respect to notions of objectivity. So it's true that for journalistic texts, emotional storytelling is valued, but it's also carefully managed and carefully policed. But what's also true is that the ability to tell personal and emotionally engaging stories is actually also central, not just to what is valued in terms of how journalists write their own stories, but also to how journalists and audiences understand public participation. And I want to explore what this has to do then with technological change, by means of talking about a couple of examples of mediated public participation. Now, when I first started studying mediated forms of public participation in the mid-1990s, the main conventional way in which ordinary people could have their voices heard in mainstream media was by writing letters to the editor. So at the time, and this was work that I did for my PhD in the mid-1990s, I did interviews with letters editors and ethnographic research to ascertain how journalists work with letters to the editor. And what became very clear was that when journalists talk about what the letters to the editor section means and why it's important, they use a normative vocabulary of objectivity and rationality. They say that they really like rational letters that contribute to public debate. But when you ask them about what specific letters they actually like, and what specific debates they thought were the most powerful and poignant, they always tended to point to these very emotional stories that were very personal and did not actually enter into any kind of political debate. So here's one example of this. This is from an editor of a newspaper in an area that's experienced a lot of growth and a lot of construction work of these very big mansions. So this person that he's talking about an individual who's writing in a letter complaining about all the construction work that is ruining this idyllic setting where he has lived all his life. And what you get here is an idea which was consistent across all my interviews, that journalists prefer authentic and emotional letters. So he says here that the resident tends to speak plainly and from the heart more than some of the political rhetoric of some of these organizations. And then he says you are getting the truth from this individual in this letter because this is how he's feeling and that's why he's writing this letter. He's not mincing words, he's not shielding his true intentions in a bunch of mumbo-jumbo. How are you going to challenge him? Are you going to say, I don't agree that there's no rule anymore? You can't challenge his opinion. Now, what's interesting about this quote is that this editor seems to suggest a very different epistemological understanding, a very different understanding of what counts as truth here. And the understanding is that the truth, in this case, comes from the emotion of this letter writer. What makes it truthful is that it is seen as somehow being authentic. And it's not truthful in the sense that, he says you can't really argue with him, you can't challenge his opinion. So it's not truthful in the sense that it's been tested by rational public debates. It's truthful in the sense that it reflects his true emotions. And that, to him, makes it much more powerful as a contribution to public discourse. So it emphasizes that you got this kind of sincerity, authenticity, and truth, and concreteness of the regular citizen and their personalized storytelling, precisely because of a perceived emotional integrity. And this kind of celebration of the truth value of emotional authenticity and how you might juxtapose it to conventional understandings of rationality is also carried over into journalists' and audiences' views of user-generated content. And this is an area that I've been working on, participated in a big study on this funded by the BBC in 2007 and 2008. And we did things like interviews with journalists, focus groups with audiences, and ethnographic observation in newsrooms. And user-generated content here is interesting because it represents a shift from the situation where audience contributions are consistently and neatly parceled off in specific sections, and towards one where they are, at least on occasion, broadcast or published alongside content provided by professional journalists. And what we found in our research was that both journalists and audience members value UGC, value user-generated content, precisely on the basis of its perceived authenticity and emotional content. And that in fact it was very often deliberately juxtaposed to the more objective and distanced and hence less engaging professional discourse of journalists. And I wanted to show you a quick example of a focus group discussion of a group of audience members, and they're talking about a clip that they've seen of a woman whose house is being flooded, and instead of running away and saving your belongings like most people would do if your house is being flooded, she took out her camera on her phone and started recording it. And as she was doing that, she talked about how she was feeling. So this might not be the most rational course of action, but it was one that was seen as being very engaging by the audience in a way that they juxtaposed to how a professional journalist would have done it. Right. So here the first respondent says, I think a professional person couldn't feel like that because that's woman, it's her home, so she's giving you a more accurate, she's bringing it home to you more than a professional person in her house. The second person here says the person behind the camera is feeling all of those things and you're seeing it literally through her eyes. And the third respondent here talks about how it's not as emotive if it's professional footage. So clearly what's at stake here, what these audience members are also talking about is notions of truthfulness, like an accuracy, how it's somehow more accurate if it's a person who's actually experiencing it themselves. And it's accurate precisely because it's more emotive and also more immediate. And because you don't have the distance provided by a professional observer. So these audience members appear to value audience content over ostensibly objective content provided by professional because it provides us with emotive information that tells us what the person behind the camera is feeling. So there's a direct challenge here to the journalistic paradigm of objectivity and also to the ways of knowing of journalistic professionalism. And what you get when journalists talk about this and when journalists try to deal with user-generated content is that they very much talk about it in terms of how we as news organizations can use this content. So journalists engage in what we might call boundary work, or what sociologists call boundary work, to try to defend themselves against these incursions from amateurs. So for example, the BBC College of Journalism's course on user-generated content is called Have They Got News for Us? And talks about how BBC can actually use this content from the audiences. So the radio editor of the BBC talked about how if we apply our journalistic skills, you can just mold these things into really good pieces of journalism. And this is very symptomatic of the journalistic discourse on user-generated content, which tries to sort of say, we can use this as a resource, but we need our professional skills to defend, or we need our journalistic skills to make this into good pieces of journalism. Now, I think I may be running out of time a little bit, but what I wanted to briefly mention here is some more recent work I've done on disasters in the media. And what interested me about talking about disaster coverage in this context is that disaster coverage is one space in journalism where journalists both have to cover the facts on the ground objectively and actually try to elicit compassion for the suffering of victims on the ground. As a result of that, disaster coverage is often seen as a site for the cultivation of compassion and disaster cosmopolitanism. And what journalists are now saying to us is that increasingly new technologies like mobile phones and social media are allowing access to stories about disasters in a way that they've never done before. And they're allowing stories from people who are actually on the ground experiencing the events as they unfold. And so, again, when you look at the interviews that we did with journalists covering disaster, you see a similar kind of discourse which emphasizes the power of contributions from ordinary people and the kind of immediacy of them, but at the same time also talks about how it enables us as journalists to produce, you know, more engaging stories than we could ever do before. And then at the same time, what you also see is new kinds of forums for people who are affected by disasters to actually talk about their own experiences. And this, for example, is the case with one of the first instances of this was the ABC online coverage of the Victoria bushfire emergency in 2009 in Australia, where in a very difficult to reach area, you got online forums were used to provide stories about what was happening on the ground. And these were very much stories from ordinary people which were told in a very different form from conventional journalism. So just to try to conclude what I've been trying to talk about today, what I'd like to suggest is that there are some significant changes, primarily of a technological nature, which are challenging conventional understandings of journalistic professionalism. And they are also challenging conventional journalistic ways of knowing, specifically in terms of valuing more emotional forms of storytelling. And so I think we have to think about, when we look at technological change, we have to ask ourselves broader questions, not merely about the consequences for the profession, but also for the nature of public discourse and the ways of knowing advanced by journalism. And so, what I'd like to suggest is that we might have a media environment in which a more emotionalized form of public discourse appears to be in some ways structurally encouraged or supported. And what I think that we need to do is to take that seriously as a shift and understand that this is in fact not all good news. That we have to look at emotions in a nuanced way, suggesting that different emotions might do different work under different circumstances. And that I think we can only analyze this with the attention it deserves if we are aware of this shift in the first place. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So the second presenter is Zvi Reich. He's a former journalist and currently he's a researcher in journalism studies at the Department of Communication at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. And he's going to tell us, or actually ask the question, whether we can see the end of the journalistic expertise.
Good morning. I will connect to the former session by talking about my emotions. Carl is okay. I cannot even start telling you how excited I am to be here. First time in Poland. Because 74 years ago, the first years of Second World War, my ancestors were deported by the Nazis from a small town near Lublin. And they went to Russia, living there as refugees for several years, and then going back to the new state of Israel. So for me, first time here, thanks God, despite this history, thanks God, and thanks to Dr. Agnieszka Stepinka, and to the University of Adam Mickiewicz, and the sponsors of this conference. I'm here with you today, very excited. When we talk about experts, we think of this kind of people. No, scientists, expert witnesses at courts, bookish intellectuals who know everything about their topic, or even, connoisseurs of wine who can smell the glass and tell you whether the winemaker was suffering from rheumatism, for example. We don't think of journalists. My question today is, to what extent we can think about journalists as experts? Can these become real experts? Can these become people who know what they are talking about? And I will refer mainly to news beat journalists. Journalists who have a fixed beat, like they cover police, they cover the treasury, they cover finance or science. You call it in Polish temat. You have a temat that you cover regularly. So can these people become real experts? No, 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 say every expert that works with journalists. Something is wrong here. So every expert that works with journalists would say no, they cannot become real experts. And if you talk to scientists, to economists, you talk even to heads of police, they will tell you that journalists cannot become experts. They are dismissive. And I would say that sometimes they are even patronizing journalism. But even journalism scholars doubt whether journalists can become experts. They call them generalists, temporary specialists, instant specialists, relatively specialists that are assigned to their domain by a stroke of an editor's pen. What does it mean? Let's say I'm an editor and Agnieszka is a reporter and I'm telling her, Agnieszka, you should go and cover the Poznan police. We need a new reporter for police. So by an editor's pen stroke, she becomes an expert. From this day on, she's our expert for police reporting. Obviously, journalists know less than some of their sources, especially when these sources are involved in scientific knowledge. But you would agree with me that after certain years of covering a certain beat, covering police, covering science, covering whatever you cover, you start learning something. So my lecture today is, what exactly is that something? What is that something that they are learning during the time? And in my lecture, I would like to make one main point and raise one question. My main point is that some journalists who cover certain beats or certain themats can become experts over the years, some of them. Obviously under some conditions, and I will obviously focus on what is the exact type of their expertise. But also I would like to raise one question, whether the current crisis in journalism, the current crisis in the media, can be seen also as a crisis of expertise. Because if the most experienced journalists are laid off, if the news beats, news themats are cancelled or merged, if there is a process of freelancization of reporters, of parachutization, that you don't have a reporter, but if something happens, then you parachute another reporter, and that the fact that reporters are less and less assessed according to their expertise, but rather according to other features in the work, is this a crisis of expertise? Exploring expertise touches very deep questions about the nature of journalism. What exactly is journalism? What do journalists do? How do we think about their activity? Is it, like you see in the famous picture on your left, is it repetitive, industrial, routine? Or is it more like handmade craftsmanship? How do we think about journalistic routines? Should we think of them like, playing classic music, that you have to follow strictly the notes of the music? Or is it more like jazz music, involving jamming, involving improvisation? To conceptualize journalistic expertise, I went to these guys, a couple of sociologists of science, Harry Collins and Robert Evans, and here you see the cover of their book from 2007, Rethinking Expertise. It's a brilliant book. By the way, they are from Cardiff University, which is also Curran's University. And I even traveled a few times to meet them and to discuss with them how their model of expertise, which I will show you immediately, it's a brilliant model, how should it be applied to journalism. Basically, I would say in one sentence, they consider themselves as a part of the third wave of science studies. If we think the first wave was positivist, the second wave was constructivist, And the third wave is more interested in expertise and performance. What actually one can do. What can you do? This is the way that they measure expertise in science. The core of their book, the core of their theory can be found in this small table, half a page in the book. They call it the periodic table of expertise. Obviously, it tries to go after the periodic table of elements. I would say it is less brilliant and less innovative and less revolutionary than Mendeleev's table, but it is full with very, very fascinating insights. For example, they raise very sophisticated questions. How come that we hear, every couple of years we hear about a doctor that wasn't a real doctor, he was impostering as a doctor, spending a few years in a hospital, and yet the real doctors did not expose him. This is a question of expertise. They ask, for example, is riding a bicycle or driving a car or even speaking your mother tongue considered expertise? And the answer is yes. And even, another example that is dealt in their book, they ask whether some European shepherds who try to protect their flocks after Chernobyl from nuclear waste, and they learn how to do that, do they become kinds of experts? So fascinating questions that they're raising, and they have, you can see their sense of humor. The most basic mode of expertise, they call it beer mat knowledge. Why beer mat knowledge? Beer mat is this small piece of cardboard that you see beneath the glass, that the bartenders put beneath the glass. Why beer mat knowledge? Because sometimes all you know about a certain topic can be written on this small piece of cardboard. So this is the basic mode of expertise. But I will talk about greater experts that are marked here in pink: interactional expertise and contributor expertise. These are the highest modes of expertise that I would like to suggest as a framework to understand journalistic expertise. So you see both here, the contributive experts. How can I get rid of this? Oh, sorry. Here they are, yes. Okay, so on your left you have the contributive expert. This is the real expert. I mean, this is the real stuff. Scientists, for example, like physicists or chemists, biochemists. I mean, these are the real people who can go into the laboratory and perform scientific work and contribute to science. They call them contributive experts. These are the people who contribute the scientific work. They do the experiment, they do the measurement. But the interesting guy is the guy on your right, the interactional expert. Interactional expert is, say, a sociologist of science who follows the physicist and goes also into the laboratory and observes how do scientists do their work. Now, after several years that our guy, the interactional expert, the sociology of science, is observing the physicist, there starts to be a very, very interesting question. What does this person understand? To what extent this person has gained expertise in what? In sociology or in physics? What's your guess? What is a more interesting question? Sociology or physics? Physics, yes, exactly. To what extent this guy has gained any expertise in physics after years of observing the physicist? I hope that some of you at least start to realizing, why do I grab you such a long distance from a journalism conference to the laboratory? What are you doing? What are we doing here? Because this is very, very relevant to journalism. It raises the question, to what extent, after years of being a police reporter, a transportation reporter, an economic reporter, to what extent I start being an expert, not in journalism, but in the fields that they cover, in police matters, in legal matters, in economic matters. They not only think that an intellectual expert can become an expert, they even have an interesting idea how to measure that, how to measure to what extent this guy, the sociologist, did really internalize some of the expertise of science. By the way, do we expect that after years in the laboratory of observing physicists, a journalist or a sociologist of science can perform the experience, the experiment, or the measurement in physics after years of observing the physicist? Yeah, you are nodding. Obviously, you are right. No, we don't expect that. So, if not doing the contributing work, what then did they learn? Collins and Evans suggest that they learn two main and important things: the discourse and the judgment. Discourse and judgment. So they know the terminology, they can speak fluently with the physicist in a physics terminology, and they also can guess the judgment. What would be the judgment? For example, if I did an experiment, to what kind of journal I'm going to submit the paper. So the sociologists of science would be able to guess that. In order not to be too theoretical, they suggest that there is a way to measure to what extent you became an expert using the famous Turing test. Just a quick reminder, Turing, after the name of the brilliant and tragic mathematician Alan Turing, the British one who deciphered the Enigma code, or one of them. I know that people from Poznan University demand their credit on the work, but he suggested a test, a simple test, to determine whether a machine or a computer has intelligence, artificial intelligence. And his test was simple. The man in blue sends queries to both room A and room B. In one room there is a computer, in the other room there is a person, and he doesn't know who sits in which room, but if the answers that he is receiving confuse him, that he cannot determine where is the computer and where is the person, then we can say that the computer has artificial intelligence. This is the original Turing test. What Collins and Evans suggest is to use the same structure in order to test the expertise of an interactional expert. So you put an interactional expert in one room, a sociologist of science, and a real physicist in another room. You send them the same questions, and you have, instead of the men in blue, you have a panel of judges, and if, let's say, for 15 minutes, they receive answers and they cannot determine where is the real physicist and where is the sociologist of science, then we can say that this person, this sociologist of science, has real interactional expertise. It's a brilliant idea. It's a brilliant idea. So I'm using their idea and bringing it to journalism. I can just say that when I visited Cardiff University, I was at Collins' office, he showed me his own test about physics of gravity after 10 years of observing physicists of gravity, and he passed successfully the test, so the panel of judges could not realize in which room he showed me that I've seen the actual test. Now, let's talk about the characteristics of interactional experts. Interactional experts, when they become really interactional experts after years of experience, have a few very interesting characteristics. First of all, they are parasitic. Parasitic in that sense that they do not specialize in their own profession. They specialize in a specialty of other people. In that sense, they are parasitic. As I said, they master the discourse and the judgments of another expertise. They cross the social borders and get access to areas that are not very accessible to the general public. They can handle a conversation with the contributing experts on an equal basis, which means it's not that the physicist can patronize the sociologist. They have to respect them, they have to respect their questions, because they have good questions, because they know the judgments, and because they know the terminology, they master the terminology. Therefore, it is on an equal basis. They cannot give the journalist or the sociologist the canonical face of their occupation. They must give them real answers. And lastly, they can serve as a deviled advocate for the real experts, which means they can intrigue them, they can confuse them, because they have good questions after years. And I think you realize already what does this have to do with journalism, because I think that the same that what they say about the sociology of science can be said about very good journalists after years of experience. And it also tells us what happens when you fire the experienced journalists in order to hire cheaper ones. What are you really losing in an area that is based on mainly on experience? From the first moment that I saw their book, I was fascinated by this term, interactional, that they use for interactional experts. This is a fascinating, you may ask me, why is it so fascinating? Why is it so useful to journalism? I have a couple of answers. First of all, this term combines knowledge and labor. How journalists did know, and what is the quality of their knowledge. So it's a very rich term for journalism studies. It is also consistent with my findings regarding the negotiated nature of news. I'm studying for the last 14 years how journalists use technology for news gathering. And guess what? What is the dominant technology that journalists use for news gathering? Can you guess? Anyone can guess? News gathering, how do you collect the information before you write your story or podcast your story? What is that?
Phone?
Exactly, the telephone. The telephone was and continues to be the most dominant technology for news gathering. How come, you can ask? You have so many new technologies, Twitter, Facebook, internet, email, instant messaging. So how come that they continue to use the telephone? And what does it prove? I'll tell you what does it prove. It proves that journalism is interactional, that you want the interaction, you want this negotiation with your source for many reasons that I cannot explain now. If there are questions about it, I will be happy to elaborate. Interactionism also is an expertise in and of itself, as I said about the sociology of science. They know how to interact with the scientists, they know how to interact with sources. Thinking about interactional expertise also places journalists in a wider context of a meta-professional context. Because if we realize that they are interactional experts, we can start comparing them very richly to other interactional experts, lawyers who investigate witnesses, intelligence officers, market analysts. There are many, many other interactional experts we can compare, we can think of to what extent they are different or share commonalities with journalists. And also, I think interactional expertise also gives us a more intelligent and less arrogant explanation about the limitation of journalistic expertise. So we don't dismiss them and say, oh, these guys are they're lazy, they are shallow, they are sloppy or hasty or stupid. No. Using the interactional concept, we understand that they are part of a very specific social settings that determines, no, determines is too much, but shapes the advantages and the limitations of their expertise. It's not that there are no stupid or shallow journalists or lazy journalists, but we don't have to postulate that they are more shallow or more stupid than lawyers, economists, or other professionals who feed them usually with information and that tend to be very arrogant when journalistic expertise is concerned. Now, in the model of Collins and Evans, they talk about interactional expertise, but there is a missing link. Interactional with whom? With whom can you interact? And I would say that there are three options here, three interesting options. You can interact with suppliers of input, like sociologists of science, intelligence officer, market analysts that interact with CEOs. All of them are interacting with suppliers of input. You can go to the other side. There are people who interact with consumers of output. So if I am a salesperson and I'm selling cars and I'm at a car hall, meeting clients, and I'm interacting with them, but this is with people who consume output. Teachers do the same. You interact with your students, you are selling them the material that you are teaching. So we explored these two options, suppliers of input and consumers of output. But in the middle, you have a third category, a third option, people who interact, whose expertise is to interact with both. So on one hand, journalists interact with their sources, with the contributive experts of their field. On the other hand, they interact with audiences. Now, I have to clarify. Journalists are not the only ones who have audiences. You can ask me, and this is a good question, well, sociologists do not have audiences? Intelligence officers, it's better that they don't have audiences, yes. But other occupations have audiences too. However, you won't find another profession where the contact with the audience is so immediate, so general, and the audiences are so lay in their expertise, and it involves every unit of input and output, which means in every story you interact both with the sources and with the audiences. You won't find it in other professions that is so intensive and involves the basic unit of production. Also in journalism, both poles, this is why I call them bipolar expertise, because it involves both poles, with audiences and with sources. So this bipolar interactional expertise. Both poles shape and legitimize each other. And this is very familiar to us. Whenever we see a press conference with experts, and then the journalist is telling the interviewee, no, this is too complicated for my audience. Can you say that more simple? So you see here the interaction between both poles. You use the interaction with the audience in your interaction with the expert. But not only that it fits to the content to audiences, making it not too complicated, it also fits journalists to the media environment. Because try to think, if journalists were real experts, if you hire an economist to report business affairs, he becomes, first of all, more expensive to hire. Then he becomes less flexible. I mean, you cannot tell him, oh, there is a fire today, go to cover the fire. No, I'm an economist, I'm not going. So you need flexible manpower. This is why you prefer to lower the expertise in your organization. So it fits to the money, to the time pressures, because real experts do not like to work under extreme time pressures. And also, if you hire real experts to work for you, they may become not very understandable to your audiences. So they will report in too complex. They will start reporting for other economists and not for the general public. This is why the point of balance between expertise and non-expertise is so delicate in journalism and involve both the audience interactionism and source interactionism. It also limits the competition inside the newsbeat, inside the temat. Because if you see health reporters, there is a tacit agreement between health reporters what kind of stuff you do not read, what kind of conferences you do not go. This is out of the game. Otherwise, every health reporter could scoop his competitors by going deeper. But there is a tacit agreement that here, this is the point where expertise stops in our temat. We don't go further. Okay, I'll finish. I will just mention there are, you don't become automatically, as a journalist, you cannot become automatically an expert. You need first some years, and there are how many years? There is a magic number. I mean, there are some psychologists of expertise who suggest they studied the Beatles, they studied technology people, masters of chess, excellent sports people, excellent musicians, and they discovered, for example, behind the Beatles, there are 10,000 hours of focused training until the age of 20. This is their formula. So, but I don't believe so much in the numbers, but I believe that you cannot become an expert after 2 years. You need more time. You need also a well-defined newsbeat, a well-defined temat. You cannot become a real expert on science reporting or on health reporting because these are so wide umbrellas that in order to understand the discourse and the judgments of cardiology, urology, other fields of medicine, you need years for each one of them. And the final criteria is that in order to become a real expert, you must violate again and again the norms of your beat and stop collecting information from hand to mouth. So you want to become an expert. If there is a press conference with scientists and everyone is grabbing the information, is running to write and to publish, you need to stay there more. You need to read not only the summary for journalists, but read entire reports. So you violate again and again the norms in order and collect more information than you need in the next story in order to become a real expert. Now, what happens during the recent years, and this is the final slide, during the recent years, I say that there is a crisis of expertise. Expertise in journalism was always dialectic, so it combines source interactionism and audience interactionism, as I suggested. It combines expertise and generalism. There was always a point of balance, a point of equilibrium between expertise and generalism, and also a shift. It was also a domain of expertise on one hand and a domain of responsibility on the other hand. What do I mean by domain of responsibility? Sometimes you are only an address for certain information. So if I'm a health reporter, I'm just an address for health information. And I would say that my main thing is not to miss stories that my competitors have. So the editor would kill me if I miss stories, and this is why it's a domain of responsibility. It's my responsibility, not real expertise. So what happens during the recent years is a shift from left to right. The point of balance is shifting to the right. More audience interactionism, more generalism, and more a newsbeat, the news temat, as a domain of responsibility rather than a domain of expertise. The main ideas here appeared in my paper that was published a year ago in Communication Theory. I'm looking forward to hear your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So our next presenter is Elda Brogi from Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom at the European University Institute in Florence. as a lawyer, I expect her to take us more to the legal aspects of the journalism.
Strzałki takie. Na slajdach, na tym nie. O tu.
Hi, good morning everybody, and thank you for this invitation to this interesting conference here at the Adam Mickiewicz University. Thank you very much to Jędrzej for this invitation. As he told before, we shared the same desk somehow, since he was sit at my desk while I was on maternity leave 1 year ago at the University Institute in Florence. And of course, I hope he had a nice experience in Florence during that period. I'm a lawyer, and probably my presentation, my slides are not so fancy as the slides of the speakers of the previous speakers. It's a feature of the lawyers, you know. My presentation is again on more specific issues related to more legal issues related to the profession of journalists. The title of my presentation is Journalists versus Journalism, because my idea in this presentation is to give some hints about the main legal issues that are raising nowadays about the role, the profession of journalism, their rights, their duties, in this new changing environment where there are professional journalists, but everybody can be a journalist. So I'm starting from some preliminary remarks that are somehow the conditions, I mean, of this are that are the topics, the main topics of this conference. It's a matter of fact that journalism is changing because in itself it is not anymore the profession of a relatively small number of people with the press card on their cap. A number of people that is determined according certain criteria that are different from country to country. For instance, this will be somehow the result of a research that we are doing at the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom. We realized that according to some surveys that we are having all across Europe or across the member states of the European Union, we realized that, for instance, defining a journalist, a professional journalist, it's quite hard because every country, every member state has its own way to define a professional journalist, first of all. For instance, for my own country, I am Italian, there is a specific law, for instance, that defines who is a professional journalist. And it's somehow an exception, but we have to deal with that, for instance. The profession of journalist has to deal with these new perspectives, new technological developments, and it has to deal with these changes from a legal perspective, of course, and from economic perspective. Our center is going to go in depth and try to find what are the economic consequences on what are the how the lack of resources in the media sector can affect directly the production of news and the condition of the journalists, the working condition of the journalists. In my presentation, so I will stress first how the profession is changing since the journalists now are working in a different environment than, let's say, 20 years ago, and how the development of new technology affect the profession. And on the other hand, since everybody now can be a journalist somehow, what is the status, let's say, of those that, who provide information and they are not professionals? So I'll first talk about professional journalists and then about citizen journalism, those who are not defined by any are not defined journalists according to any specific legal or union definition. The first challenge of the new professional, I'm going to give some hints about that because I hope, since I saw that there are so many speakers, that probably we could have a debate on that. Then the main challenges that the professionals are facing are those that deal with the use of new technologies as new means to gather information and as means to distribute it. So what does it mean? That before we said that usually journalists gather news through telephone calls by direct sources, let's say, but it's a matter of fact that new technology enhances the possibility of finding news on the web, and journalists have to deal with that possibility according to some ethical standards, in my opinion. So, for instance, some of the deontological problems that are rising are those related, for instance, to personal data that are on the websites, that are circulating on the web. I make some remarks about these kind of problems because the case law of national and European court now is starting to face these specific problems and addressing them. For instance, if I ask you as a journalist, if you should publish the content of an email on your newspaper, how should you behave? Do you publish them without any ethical problem, let's say, or do you think that maybe this is against a specific law that forbids you to publish personal correspondence? Is an email exchange a personal correspondence? Are you allowed to publish it? That's a question that looks quite simple somehow, but for instance, on the nature of the email correspondence, there are many. There is a lot of academic literature, and then courts cases that say, for instance, that are divided. Somebody says that an email exchange is public information because, for instance, those who received the email are more than two persons, for instance, and there is another case law that says that in any case an email exchange is personal information, and so it must be kept secret. It has this feature of it's personal, and so it cannot easily published on a newspaper. There was, for instance, a case in Italy. I refer mostly to Italian cases and European cases in my presentation, where a editor-in-chief of a newspaper was convicted because he had published the content of a closed mailing list. For instance, about the nature of a mailing list, of an exchange of messages through a public mailing list. About that, I mean, it's really an issue. Is a mailing list information contains? Does it contain information that is public, or is that private correspondence? So, for instance, this is a new problem that new technology poses. Other question. Nowadays, there is this massive use of social networks. What about, for instance, the pictures that are uploaded on a Facebook profile? Personal pictures of the owner of this Facebook profile. If you are a journalist, are you allowed to publish all the pictures that are public somehow, but are public for a certain number of persons that share with the owner of the Facebook account that information? So again, is a Facebook account public information, or is it information that is shared between private persons, and so it is not cannot used as a source of public information? These are issues, of course, related to the use of personal data. And, of course, there are issues that are relating to the use of the web as a means to distribute information. One of the most common situation is related, for instance, to websites of newspapers that have the possibility to add comments to the articles there that are posted, or in any case, the possibility of adding comments to a website. How to deal with comments in the newspaper website? This is another, let's say, challenge of the new journalist, the journalist who publishes its article on a web page, on the web page of its own newspaper. For instance, one of the main issues is the editor-in-chief responsible for the comments that are added to an article on a web page? The temptation is to ask you if you know the answer. It should be. Why?
Because he's responsible for everything that is going on in
Yes.
the newspaper.
He is responsible from the
He's the
print.
But he's the gatekeeper. I mean,
He, of course, okay, he is a gatekeeper, but we can argue also that internet and the web is a different environment than the print press. Of course, he, in the rationale of the laws that require him to be responsible for the print press, for the paper, for the printed version of the newspaper, we are okay, in a sense that the editor-in-chief is responsible for the contents that are published in the newspaper. When it comes to talk about internet and the web in general, the things are a little bit different, because internet is not print press. One of the main debate of the academics and also of the courts is how to apply to internet, if it is possible to apply to internet the same rules that are applied to the print press. Because it's true that the editor-in-chief must be responsible of the contents, otherwise he is not an editor-in-chief, of course. But it's quite hard for a human, let's say, to be responsible for something that is in a continuous way updated on the web. The editor-in-chief is not obliged somehow to stand in front of a screen and see the different updates of the website according to the new comments. We must see how this, I mean, the law must be proportional, I mean, with the effective condition, with the situation, with the specific case. So, in general, the academics and jurisprudence says that the application of print press rules is not automatic to the web. This already? Okay, all right. And what does it mean? That, for instance, I'll go through quickly. There is this European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence that in a different way, for instance, from what the Italian Corte di Cassazione says that the editor-in-chief is responsible for instance, defamatory comments. While, for instance, our Italian Supreme Court said that the editor-in-chief of an online publication cannot be asked to control the contents of the comments, and so he is not responsible as the editor-in-chief of a printed newspaper. Another example could be, for instance, the right of reply. Same rules on the internet as are the same rules that are set for the print press. Another specific issue that is raised by the use of the internet, for instance, is the issue of the specific right to be forgotten. How to deal with it? In which sense? Again, I can recall a case law of our Corte di Cassazione, which says that at a certain point, an article that was published on an online version of a newspaper, for instance, must be removed, must be untagged, and it cannot be, it can be stored somehow in archives in order not to allow the users for instance, search engines to retrieve it forever. So, articles, journalists' articles, at a certain point, at least for the Italian case law, must be archived, and in order to access them, the interest person must go and open the specific archive of the newspaper. So, as everybody knows, here in this assembly, new technologies allow cheap access to the internet and the possibility to reach a wide audience with a minimum effort. And non-professional journalists are growing because new technologies are cheap, are easy, and can allow everybody to be a potential journalist. This means that the traditional organization of the media industry itself is heavily changing, and as the high-level group report said, the high-level group report, as you probably know, was a report that was written at the beginning of, delivered at the beginning of 2013 by a group of experts set by the European Commission. The new media environment landscape reinforces the trend towards freelancing, driven by new technology and driven by funding problems, with media companies relying less on highly trained staff and more on content provision that can come from a wide range of people, not necessarily just journalists. So, not only journalists nowadays are those who inform the public, because freedom of expression, freedom of information, and the freedom to inform is guaranteed not only to journalists, but in any case by constitutional rules to everybody. The Court of the Human Court for Human Rights already acknowledges this shift somehow, because in one of its case law specifically verbatim says that for instance, a ONG can be called as a social watchdog, as usually, journalists are called watchdogs. So a journalist, an NGO, can be has the same rights to receive information of general interest as a media outlet has, a sort of clarification of the two categories. Since journalists, professional journalists, are more and more challenged by the rise of these new categories of journalists, what is the difference between the treatment of professional journalists and non-professional journalists? Briefly, probably one difference is the treatment of the reporter's privilege, because according to your professional status, you can claim to have this privilege, the reporter's privilege, related to the disclosure of sources, undisclosure of sources in this case. And just to stress what the debate is going to, this is the debate that is very actual in the US. There are some proposals to go in the sense to avoid any definition of journalist and adopt a broader definition of journalism in order to define those who are entitled to have special rights according to the function they are carrying out. So instead of talking about journalists, maybe we should start talking about journalism and start thinking of what kind of duties and responsibilities have those who commit, as in some literature in the US they are starting to say, acts of journalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We we got one more presentation. It will be given by Olga Sukomlin and Tatiana Trashuk from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev. So that will be the last presentation, and after this presentation we will start the discussion, okay? So if you are thinking about any comments and questions, just be prepared, because then there will be opportunity to share them with us, okay?
Good afternoon, everybody. We came here with my colleague Olga. We came from Ukraine, the National University, Taras Shevchenko, the Institute of Journalism. And in the beginning, I want to send you greetings from the teachers and students of the Institute of Journalism, and they are now on the streets. Okay, and they are now on the streets and squares in Kiev, defending their rights and choice to be in the European community. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support. And I'd like to talk about some of the current trends in the development of Ukrainian periodical press and online media. Some of the trends are as follows. The decline of daily newspapers due to several reasons. Firstly, it's their inability to satisfy the growing informational demands of the readers. Secondly, decreasing numbers of copies of periodicals, and thirdly, migration of readers to the internet. So the share of daily newspapers is around 1% of all newspapers, while weeklies represent almost 85% of all total of the periodicals. Other trends are active development of online versions of print media, especially at the regional level, and the fast growth of online readership. In many cases, the online readership of successful outlets exceeds the number of copies and the readership of one issue of publication. But on the other hand, the rapid development of internet has led to some negative consequences in print media. Almost 1,000 national print media were closed during 2011-2012 years due to several reasons, of course, but one of them is a change in people's information-seeking behavior. So, internet continues expands its influence on everyday life of citizens. So another trend is the high ratings of social networks require the presence of mass media on these platforms. but it's only in the last 2-3 years Ukrainian online media have started creating very official pages on social networks and adding Twitter, Facebook and etc. share buttons. For instance, Ukrainian Truth, Ukrainska Pravda, literal translation, Ukrainian Truth, and Correspondent.net are the most successful and famous online media in Ukraine. And they lead in their Facebook subscribers. And by the way, on the last Sunday, Ukrainian Truth was named to European Truth. And and they cover the breaking news of the mass Ukrainian protest against the government's decision to reject trade deal with European Union. And this site suffered hacking attacks, but journalists continued writing their reports on Facebook and Twitter. There is the other trend of data journalism and visualization tools becoming more and more popular in Ukrainian online media. For instance, Ukrainian site Teksty.org.ua contains interesting articles for people who want to know what is really happening in Ukraine and in the whole world. And the creators of this site believe that it's not enough for journalism to inform, it's very important to offer some solutions to different problems. And for example, they created a series of infographics about the benefits of the agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, and they used some pictures to explain and demonstrate the benefits to Ukrainians in social policy, consumers protection, culture, science, space, and etc. for example. And the other trends, according to media experts, there are some negative trends as well. Online media is competing in the speed of coverage instead of quality, and often traditional media tends to yell of journalism. The media industry often ignores the standards of journalism and the public interest. There is also the lack of professionalism in the journalistic community, and very often the media just reprint press releases or information published in the social media. And so the intellectual work of journalism is just being replaced by mechanical copy-pasting, unfortunately. And for example, Ukrainian Face News site, UA Review, has frequently been made a newsmaker in Ukraine and in Russia, publishing fictional news, and that later got reprinted as true news by numerous media. For example, such was a news item about Ukrainian famous soccer player Andriy Shevchenko heading the pension of fund in Ukraine. And many journalists didn't verify the source of information, they just used the buttons Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V and reposted this fake news, unfortunately. And another trend is journalism has lost its monopoly on use as a professionally made product. And media content is created with the help of a wide audience. And so question arises, can citizen journalism replace professional journalism? As for me, the answer is no, but I want to give the floor to my colleague Olga, and she'll try to answer this question. Thank you.
Witam Państwa i przepraszam, że nie będzie mówić po polsku, bo czuję, że mój język polski nie jest idealny. I will speak only some words about citizen journalism in Ukraine, because when I prepared my presentation 2 weeks ago, I thought that citizen journalism didn't exist in Ukraine, but now we see that it exists in Ukraine, and I will talk about modern Ukrainian context according to the current event. I will tell you some words. It's my vocabulary for today. It's Maidan and revolution, because the crowds on Ukrainian streets, we say that it is revolution, but you know that it's just a protest. When we speak about citizen journalism, we use different words. For example, public journalism, participatory journalism, street journalism, or grassroots media. But the main ideas is in collecting, reporting, analyzing, and disseminating news and information. It is the same what we have in a traditional journalism. And when we speak about citizen journalism, we speak about alternative and activist form of news gathering outside mainstream media. And first of all, we speak about unique content. We need to speak about difference between quick media, because when we see some event, we can tell you to your audience about this event very quickly, and then you can tell about this event immediate after this event, and at last we can tell about this event in real time, online, by online broadcasting. And when we speak about citizen journalism or materials of citizen journalism, we speak about materials without moderation or pre-moderation. And sometimes these materials are without any journalistic norms. When we speak about the authors of citizen journalism, we speak about non-professional journalists or amateurs, and I need to explain the differences between two things. Non-professional journalist means that person who write, but they don't have a journalistic education, but they have a willing to write, and they want to gather news and to propose this news to the audience. Sometimes in citizen journalism is no interest in being conclusions. Okay. Okay, just one chart, because you can see the spike is the highest level in social in people activities in social medias at last 3 years. It was this week when we had this protest at the square. Okay, it's online broadcasting and video, and Okay, my conclusions. It's traditional media and social media. It's two parallel trends, and I think it will be continue to be together and maybe to make better each other. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So right now I would like to start the discussion, and I would like to start with our guests here, because we've got representatives of the media organizations and journalism associations. So my question first is, would you like to share any comments on the presentations you all have already heard, or would you like some questions to the presenters? And then there will be an opportunity to the others to also ask questions and share some comments. So would you like to comment on anything? Okay.
Dziękuję bardzo. Nazywam się Piotr Frydryszek. 40 parę lat spędziłem w radiu, więc jestem radiowcem od początku do końca. Ja chciałbym kilka zdań poświęcić problemom, które blokują właściwie profesjonalizację dziennikarstwa. Bo skoro decydujemy się mówić o profesjonalizacji, to znaczy, że taką ukrytą intencją jest dążenie do podniesienia poziomu tego zawodu. I skoncentruję się tylko na dwóch czynnikach, ponieważ czasu jest niewiele. Pierwszym takim czynnikiem jest bez wątpienia komercjalizacja mediów. Dziennikarze w wyniku tej komercjalizacji są poddani w znacznym stopniu dyktatowi właścicieli wydawców. Dotyczy to zwłaszcza mediów komercyjnych. No, bo dla właścicieli media to taki sam biznes jak każdy inny. Podchodną tego jest oczywiście postawa wydawcy, dla którego najważniejsza jest sprzedawalność dziennikarskiego produktu. Od dziennikarza oczekuje się przede wszystkim szybkości, efektywności za możliwie jak najniższą garzę. Dotyczy to przede wszystkim tych mediów ogólnokrajowych, tych dużych graczy na rynku. I tutaj chciałbym przywołać pewien przykład, który zobrazuje taki właśnie sposób myślenia o tym, czym media powinny się zajmować, a czym się nie powinny zajmować. Uczestniczyłem ostatnio w takiej międzynarodowej konferencji poświęconej starzeniu się i starości i tam jednym z paneli był panel poświęcony medialnemu odbiciu starzenia i starości w mediach. Był raport Krajowej Rady Radiofonii i Telewizji o tym, jak traktują to media elektroniczne, i był raport monitoring press media, jak funkcjonuje to w prasie. Dotyczyło to roku ubiegłego, a więc roku szczególnego, bo to był rok seniora. No i tutaj zaobserwowano pewne pozytywne zjawiska, ale generalnie jest kiepsko. A takim przykładem myślenia o tym, właśnie tej komercjalizacji, jest wypowiedź jednego z wydawców, dużych wydawców, wybitnych wydawców, nie będę przytaczał tutaj nazwiska, który w takiej debacie na temat funkcjonowania tej tematyki w mediach powiedział, że starość i starzenie się to nie są tematy konsumpcyjne i że tutaj nie należy liczyć na to, żeby to się pojawiało w mediach, ponieważ ludzie starzy po pierwsze postrzegani są jako grupa nudna, odchodząca, po drugie nie manifestują, nie urządzają protestów, nie są uczestnikami skandali. No więc jeżeli tak, to właściwie wydawca tutaj nie ma wiele do zrobienia i tym się nie należy zajmować. I to jest oczywiście taki bardzo ekstremalny przykład stanowiska, ale on obrazuje właśnie skutki tej komercjalizacji. Tutaj w tej sytuacji nie do przecenienia rolę mają media publiczne. Media publiczne, które z racji swojej misji powinny zajmować się również i taką tematyką i tutaj obserwujemy pozytywne trendy. Oczywiście do tego, żeby było, jak mówił Lech Wałęsa, w tym temacie dobrze, to jest jeszcze daleka. I to jest komercjalizacja. A drugi czynnik, który moim zdaniem bardzo źle wpływa na profesjonalizację zawodu dziennikarskiego, to jest czynnik, to jest głęboki, pełen zacietrzewienia podział polityczny wśród dziennikarzy w Polsce. On zdecydowanie utrudnia, a momentami wręcz uniemożliwia jakąkolwiek debatę wewnątrzśrodowiskową na tematy standardów zawodowych. A takie debaty na temat standardów wewnątrzśrodowiskowych byłyby jak najbardziej pożądane. Dziękuję bardzo.
Witam Państwa serdecznie, nazywam się Albert Stawiszyński, na co dzień jestem radcą prawnym i tutaj na tej konferencji reprezentuję Stowarzyszenie Dziennikarzy Polskich. Bardzo chciałem podziękować wszystkim przedmówcom, w szczególności osobom z zagranicy, którzy pokazali nam, jak wygląda tam dziennikarstwo. Natomiast ja chciałem Państwa przenieść trochę w inne klimaty. Ten mój referat potrwa 5 minut, Państwo pozwolicie, że wstanę. Ale wyobraźmy sobie, że każdy z Państwa na tej sali jest dziennikarzem. Mamy tutaj naukowców, profesorów, ale wyobraźmy sobie, że jesteśmy dziennikarzami i wyobraźcie sobie Państwo, że jesteście dziennikarzami w jakiejś specjalizacji, w jakiejś określonej specjalizacji. Wszyscy znaleźliśmy taką specjalizację? W głowie? Znaleźliśmy. Dobrze. I teraz wyobraźmy sobie, że jesteśmy dziennikarzami jutra, czyli takimi dziennikarzami jutra, którymi są dziennikarze w pełni profesjonalni, czyli tacy jak tytuł tej dzisiejszej konferencji, czyli dziennikarz jutra, pełen profesjonalista. I kim jest taki dziennikarz, a w zasadzie kim powinien być? Pan profesor pomógł mi trochę w klasyfikowaniu tego dziennikarza profesjonalisty, ponieważ dziennikarz według mnie profesjonalista to przede wszystkim specjalista w swojej dziedzinie. Czyli specjalizujący się w określonej branży. To tak samo jak z lekarzem. Proszę Państwa, jeżeli mamy lekarza, który jest chirurgiem, doskonałym chirurgiem, a za godzinę pójdzie na blok operacyjny, gdzie jest to blok, gdzie będzie przeprowadzona operacja oka, to przecież to nie jest specjalista z tej dziedziny. On się nie powinien tym zajmować. Czyli prawnik, dziennikarz jutra to powinien być przede wszystkim specjalista. Dzisiaj niestety, jeśli chodzi o dziennikarzy, w mojej ocenie dziennikarze nie specjalizują się w określonych branżach. Nie starają się specjalizować. Czyli pierwsza odpowiedź na pytanie tej konferencji to jest specjalizacja. Druga rzecz, istotna z punktu widzenia profesjonalizacji dziennikarstwa, w mojej ocenie fundamentalna, to doskonalenie zawodowe dziennikarzy. Nie ma w Polsce profesjonalnego doskonalenia zawodowego dziennikarzy. Ono jest na poziomie uniwersyteckim, czyli do pewnego stopnia, czyli uzyskania powiedzmy tytułu magistra dziennikarstwa. Natomiast później jak taka osoba pracuje w mediach, w różnych mediach, to nie ma doskonalenia zawodowego. Czyli druga kwestia, jeśli chodzi o profesjonalizację, jeżeli chcielibyśmy takiego dziennikarza jutra odnaleźć, czyli musi być to osoba, która doskonali się zawodowo. Trzecia rzecz, fundamentalna, ja nie wiem jak to wygląda za granicą, tak do końca, to są zasady deontologii zawodowej, czyli kodeks etyki. Polskie przepisy odnoszą się do tej kwestii, mówią, że dziennikarz jest zobowiązany do stosowania zasad etyki zawodowej oraz zasad współżycia społecznego. Natomiast jaki kodeks etyki zawodowej obowiązuje w Polsce dziennikarzy. Dziennikarz jutra powinien mieć jeden kodeks, natomiast obowiązuje dzisiaj wiele kodeksów w zależności od tego, w jakim dziennikarz jest w stowarzyszeniu, w jakiej redakcji pracuje. Czyli jeżeli obowiązuje wiele kodeksów, to znaczy, że nie obowiązuje żaden kodeks.
Dlaczego Pan mówi, że nie obowiązuje? Karta etyczna mediów jest tym dominującym kodeksem. Wszyscy dziennikarze chyba o tym wiedzą.
Wszyscy.
W Amerykach, gdzie istnieje 10 czy 15 kodeksów i rzeczywiście nie bardzo wiadomo, co
Jeśli nie słychać, ale nie... Musimy mieć mikrofony, proszę Państwa.
I Państwo, ta
Ale to
konferencja jest
dyskusja za
tłumaczona.
chwileczkę, dobrze?
Tak, jeśli można dyskusję za moment przełożyć, bo musimy podawać mikrofon, bo jeżeli
Bardzo
Państwo nie
proszę.
mówicie do mikrofonu, nie słyszy Pani tłumaczka, w tym momencie goście z zagranicy są wyłączeni z tej dyskusji, tak? To ja też...
Oczywiście nie zgodzę się z stwierdzeniem. Uważam, że obowiązuje wiele kodeksów. Oczywiście ten kodeks też istnieje, nikt o nim nie wie. Ja jestem radcą prawnym, nie obowiązuje jeden kodeks zawodowy. Natomiast w Polsce jest 19 okręgowych izb radców prawnych i gdyby każda izba miała swój własny kodeks, to mielibyśmy chaos organizacyjny i w zasadzie nikt by nie wiedział, jakie zasady stosować. Dziennikarz jutra, jeden kodeks. Poza tym kwestie pewnej odpowiedzialności związanej z wykonywaniem zawodu. W Polsce mamy 17 zawodów zaufania publicznego. Są to takie zawody, które mają swoje oparcie przede wszystkim w artykule 17 ustęp 1 Konstytucji, który gwarantuje tym osobom wykonującym ten zawód, gwarantuje im, że oni mają podstawę konstytucyjną do wykonywania tego wolnego zawodu. Niestety w grupie tych 17 zawodów nie ma zawodu dziennikarza. Nie ma zawodu dziennikarza. Dziennikarz jutra powinien być 18 z tych zawodów. Powinien być 18 z tych zawodów, wówczas miałby mocne i silne podstawy konstytucyjne. I tak można byłoby wymieniać bardzo wiele tych elementów tego dziennikarza jutra. Mam ich katalog cały, natomiast nie chcę już Państwa zanudzać tymi kolejnymi elementami dziennikarza jutra. Natomiast jaka jest konkluzja i jak zrobić, żeby taki dziennikarz jutra powstał? Co jest do tego potrzebne? Czy jest do tego potrzebny ustawodawca, to pewnie powie Pan Senator. Czy ustawodawca może tu pomóc? Natomiast w mojej ocenie ustawodawca na dzisiaj nie może tu pomóc. Nie może tu pomóc. Dlaczego? Dlatego, że żeby powstał taki dziennikarz idealny, to potrzebna jest, i tutaj rzucę takie hasło, pewna umowa społeczna pomiędzy dziennikarzami a pracodawcami. Czyli pracodawcy i dziennikarze powinni usiąść do stołu i określić dzisiaj zasady funkcjonowania tego zawodu, bo w rękach, tak jak powiedział też mój przedmówca, przewodniczący Rady Nadzorczej Radia Merkury, czyli przedstawiciel biznesu, przedstawiciel pracodawcy, czyli pracodawcy powinni dzisiaj trochę usiąść z dziennikarzami do stołu i określić zasady tej pewnej umowy społecznej w tej określonej branży. Żeby określić te zasady obopólnej współpracy, bo dzisiaj doskonale Państwo wiedzą, jak wygląda praca dziennikarza w mediach, ja nie będę o tym szerzej mówił. Czy do takiego ideału dojdziemy? Nie wiem, mam nadzieję, że dyskusja i to, co powiedziałem, spowoduje, że być może Państwo będziecie mieli też inne koncepcje na to, jak to zrobić. Ja przedstawiłem jedną z możliwych, być może jest to koncepcja kontrowersyjna. Dziękuję.
Ja się nazywam Ryszard Sławiński, reprezentuję Stowarzyszenie Dziennikarzy Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej. Proszę Państwa, ja chciałem podnieść jakby w nawiązaniu do obu wypowiedzi moich znakomitych kolegów kwestię pauperyzacji zawodu dziennikarskiego w naszym kraju. To nie jest tak, że każdy może być profesjonalnym dziennikarzem i każdy może z tego żyć. Coraz bardziej w Polsce, mówię o tym powszechnym dziennikarstwie profesjonalnym, trudno jest wyżyć z dziennikarstwa, czy radiowego, czy pisanego, czy wreszcie już
coraz powszechniejszego internetowego. Dziennikarstwo obywatelskie, które jest rzeczywiście w okresie dynamicznego wzrostu i ma do powiedzenia, to jedno, natomiast dziennikarstwo profesjonalne, które powinno się lokować gdzieś tam w strukturach redakcji, w strukturach takich profesjonalnych jednostek organizujących dziennikarstwo, i tutaj jest no, dosyć marnie. Dziennikarz, który tutaj w znakomitej uczelni, Uniwersytecie Adama Mickiewicza, kończy studia, jest pełen wiedzy, jest pełen ochoty, świat idzie zmieniać, przychodzi do redakcji na prowincję i spotyka go 1000 złotych miesięcznie i poczucie, że w każdej chwili tego prezydenta, tego burmistrza, tego wójta może zwolnić, może wyrzucić. I to jest rekompensatą za te kolejne 1000 czy 2000 złotych. Czy jest? Kolega był uprzejmy zwrócić uwagę na ten problem zaufania publicznego. To się przecież uposażenie dziennikarza mieści się również w tym zaufaniu czy jego braku. Wreszcie angażowanie się dziennikarzy po określonych stronach politycznych. W Polsce jest to zjawisko ostatnich lat. Zjawisko, które słychać, które bije w oczy, które jest potwornie niepokojące. Mówienie o rzetelności, o obiektywizmie, o takich różnych wzniosłych rzeczach w obecnej rzeczywistości, gdzie nastąpiła taka no, pluralizacja zawodowa i mówienie o tych wzniosłych cechach zawodu dziennikarskiego jest takie trochę ponad miarę. Oczywiście na tych konferencjach, na spotkaniach my sobie możemy mówić, klasyfikować, nazywać i tak dalej. Jeśli to nie będzie wsparte jakimś przyzwoitym zarabianiem pieniędzy przez zawodowych dziennikarzy, podkreślam, to będziemy mieli problem. Wreszcie pan ze stowarzyszenia naszego zaprzyjaźnionego powiedział, że kwestie prawne, ja tylko zasygnalizuję, nie ma, jeśli profesor Sobczak w swoim wstępnym wystąpieniu mówi, że w Polsce nie mamy nazwanego zawodu dziennikarstwa. Co to jest dziennikarz, kto to jest dziennikarz, co to jest dziennikarstwo? Mówię o prawnej regulacji. No to o czym dalej mówimy? Nie możemy się doprosić. Problem jest po 1994 roku, kiedy przestała obowiązywać ustawa Prawo prasowe, w zasadzie ta stara, nowelizacje, takie różne dopiski w tym prawie niewiele już dają. Czas jest nowy, natomiast odnoszę wrażenie, już kończę, że tym, którzy sprawują aktualnie władzę, jest to na rękę. Brak regulacji, brak poukładania w tych sprawach, wreszcie brak takich wykrystalizowanych form funkcjonowania redakcji jest na rękę, ponieważ środowiska dziennikarskie, o czym również tutaj jedno zdanie padło, są podzielone, są niejednoznaczne, niejednorodne, politycznie uwikłane. Marniutko to wygląda, ale bądźmy dobrej myśli, jeśli tu padają słowa o dziennikarstwie jutra, to mam nadzieję, że takie się wykluje. Dziękuję ślicznie.
I would like just to remind you that the next session will be fully dedicated to the topic of the legal aspects of the journalism in Poland. So maybe this time in this session, if there are any questions related to more general picture of journalism and professional, so maybe we may use our experts, we may use our guests. You are more than welcome to ask any questions or share the comments. Is anyone interested?
Tak, jeżeli można, ja bym chciał zadać pytanie pani profesor Val Jorgensen. Jeżeli można, to postaram się zadać to pytanie w języku angielskim. To też dobra okazja, żeby powtórzyć sobie. So, I would like to ask you a question concerning your presentation. And, well, it reminds me of some conception that years ago Professor John Calhoun Merrill actually promulgated. And he made this clear-cut distinction between emotional journalism, or in other words, quote, existential journalism according to his conception, and just rational journalism. So, well, actually, my question is pretty subjective, I would say. I would like you to give me a closer idea of what is your main message of this. You know, according to this, I could conclude that you're actually against this rational news journalism, which is very often deprived of emotions and apparently neutral, I guess, apparently in light of your presentation, and soulless and cold. And I would say that real journalism to you is a journalism including emotions, because journalism in general is maybe more about arts, more about humanistic field of knowledge than about science. So is this message just okay, or maybe just I'm a little bit too enthusiastic about this?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think that the main message really is that I personally don't have any normative investment either way. The main message that I would like to put across is to say that I think that, at least in sort of Western traditions of journalism and also Western traditions of scholarship in journalism, we have too frequently failed to see the fact that emotion is actually a very central part of journalistic tools. And that has consequences in terms of understanding how emotions, whether it be, you know, passion and love, or whether it's hatred or anger or intolerance, how this plethora of emotions actually operate in public discourse. I mean, if I have any normative investment myself, it is on the one hand in the idea that professional journalism is actually incredibly important, precisely for the reason that journalists have certain professional skills to be able to deliver information to the public that the public needs. But on the other hand, that journalistic storytelling in an engaging way is also a set of journalistic skills associated with the profession, but that we have been too blinded to the role of emotion in journalistic storytelling and to what it actually does. And then relating to that, a second sort of correlated message has to do with the place of technological change and how that ushers in new forms of audience participation and therefore new forms of knowing, which might further prioritize emotional forms of storytelling. So I would say that that's the main message. But thank you.
Any other question or comment to the presentations or to the debate right now? No questions? No comments? There's one or two? Okay.
Dariusz Drążyk, Wyższa Szkoła Kultury Społecznej i Medialnej. Ja może takie refleksje, ale też jednocześnie może pytanie, nie wiem tak naprawdę do kogo skierować. Wydaje mi się, że bardziej do przedstawicieli stowarzyszeń dziennikarskich. Najpierw serdeczne podziękowanie dla pani profesor Karin Wall, która mówiła na temat zarządzania emocjami między innymi, bo wydaje się, że pośród tych wszystkich wartości, które determinują nasze wybory, tak przynajmniej twierdzi Bruce Newman, wartość emocjonalna jest tą, która jest jakby taka najtrwalsza i najwyraźniejsza. I dzisiaj to zarządzanie emocjami w przypadku mediów społecznościowych jest ogromne. Ci profesjonalni dziennikarze, czyli ci, którzy funkcjonują w jakichś jednostkach redakcyjnych, także te emocje próbują wywoływać. Powstają media społecznościowe także, nie tylko w tym wymiarze internetowym, ale mam na myśli chociażby, ponieważ także Pracuję w Radiu Maryja, w telewizji Trwa i w sobotę 22. rocznica powstania tego radia. I od 22 lat gdzieś wokół tego radia wytworzyła się społeczność, która jest czymś więcej niż słuchaczami. Chociażby sprawa związana z obecnością telewizji Trwam na cyfrowym multiplexie, gdzie 2,5 miliona podpisów, gdzie mnóstwo marszów, ponad 180 marszów w Polsce i poza granicami, więc ta społeczność została też wytworzona i tutaj w jakimś sensie też ta wartość emocjonalna odgrywała swoją rolę, więc za to chciałem podziękować. Natomiast takie pytanie, czy profesjonalizacja też dziennikarstwa oznacza obiektywizm i czym byłby ten obiektywizm? Ponieważ tutaj pojawiła się taka teza, pewnie słuszna, że dzisiaj świat dziennikarski jest mocno upartyjniony, upolityczniony i tak jest. Trudno tutaj z tym dyskutować. Natomiast właśnie czy ta profesjonalizacja, o której mówimy, zakładałaby obiektywizm, czyli odejście od tego upolitycznienia, de facto może spluralizowania także, bo wydaje się, że pluralizm jest czymś dobrym, a wybór z kolei źródła, na przykład reprezentującego taki światopogląd, takie spojrzenie, ewentualnie, nie wiem, taką część sceny politycznej, zależałaby konkretnie od odbiorcy, tak? Czyli pluralizm, z drugiej strony równowaga, informacja i publicystyka. Przecież publicystów czytamy dlatego, że chociażby ze względu na nazwisko. On może na różne tematy się wypowiadać, ale nazwisko jest najważniejsze dla publicysty, tak? I jego jakiś tam światopogląd, który nam sprzedaje. No i na końcu, może, ponieważ też jestem księdzem, więc ojcowie Kościoła mawiają, czym się karmisz, tak żyjesz. No i w tym też coś pewnie jest. Bardzo Państwu dziękuję za tę część prelekcyjną.
Just a quick response, because I suspect that, sorry, I realized I was getting it back in Polish. And I wonder if Svi might have something to say on this as well, but just wanted to thank you for that very interesting example, and also just to reflect that in most sort of Anglo-American historical accounts of professionalism, the ideal of objectivity and political detachment has been seen as a key development in terms of being associated very closely with professionalism, whereas other media systems have tended to have other models of professionalism which have enabled forms of external pluralism, for example, to use Helen and Mancini's term. So that I think that's certainly for me when I'm talking about historical accounts of ideals of objectivity, is also important to keep in mind that this is a very historically and geographically specific understanding of professional journalism, and that you have to look at what each specific national context, so what is the tradition of journalism in Poland, and what does that tell us about relations to objectivity and also questions around pluralism, before you can really make these kinds of judgments about what constitutes professionalism. But it's certainly something that's very important in kind of Anglo-American accounts of the relationship between professionalism and objectivity.
I think that one of the things that are interesting in our session today is that we try to cross the old questions of objectivity, subjectivity, which actually the discussions in journalism is really stuck in this old argument. And we suggest here some progress to talk about expertise, to talk about emotions. So these are new directions that actually refresh the discussion about the role of journalism beyond these old expressions of objectivity and subjectivity. I'm afraid, by the way, that I convinced you too much I didn't want to convince you too much about how the journalism of tomorrow should look like, because, I mean, the beauty in journalism is that it is somewhat chaotic. There's no too much order, so you see objectivity, subjectivity, emotions, you see professionalism, you see non-professional way, you see expertise, and you see also the generalism. And this is part of many creative industries, that if you will insert too much order into it, you will kill it. You're going to this is why I think we should tolerate some chaos inside journalism, because this is one of the characteristics of creative organizations. And journalism is, at the end of the day, journalism should be creative, and we should be careful about their creativity.
Proszę Państwa, zanim zaproszę Państwa na kawę, na przerwę kawową, to nikt mi wolno będzie skorzystać z możliwości, że jestem akurat przy mikrofonie i chciałbym zadać pytanie Eldzie Brogi, bowiem to wystąpienie było niezwykle ciekawe, dotykało tego problemu, który właściwie jest nie tylko aktualny w Polsce, ale właściwie można powiedzieć wszędzie. I teraz chciałbym zapytać o taką rzecz. Od pewnego czasu toczy się dyskusja dotycząca kompetencji Unii Europejskiej w zakresie mediów. Właściwie Unia Europejska sama wkroczyła w tę dyskusję poprzez przyjęcie dyrektywy o audiowizualnych usługach medialnych. Pytanie jest teraz takie. Ja wiem, że Elda była współautorką raportu dla Komisji Europejskiej, który powstał w CMPF-ie UI dotyczącym tego zagadnienia. Czy możliwe jest w ogóle, żeby w ramach kompetencji Unii Europejskiej zastanawiać się nad możliwością regulacji statusu zawodowego dziennikarza?
Thank you for the question. And yes, with the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom, we were asked to carry out this study on the competences of the European Union regarding media freedom and media pluralism. And we somehow found out that the European Union can reconstruct from the treaties some specific competence on that field. According to the entire, let's say, process that was carried out by the European Commission in this regard, beside our report, there was also this high-level group report that I mentioned before during my presentation. And this report specifically speaks about journalists and the possibility that the European Union gives some common standards at European level, not gives, maybe supports the creation of common standards for journalism. If maybe it is possible in theory, this high-level group report was heavily criticized by journalists, especially from journalists from the UK, who interpret it as the first step of the European Union into their business somehow, and a way the European Union starts to, let's say, regulate journalism. So I don't know if it is politically, let's say, feasible such a thing to create some European common standards on journalism.